Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, President of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to Episode 8 of the JFK Assassination, 60 years later. When we left off in the last episode, we were talking about Saundra Spencer, the Navy petty officer who testified before the Assassination Records Review Board that she had been asked on the weekend of the assassination to develop the official autopsy photographs for President Kennedy's autopsy. It was a classified operation. She had kept her secret for some 30 years or more. And when the ARRB showed her the official photographs showing the back of President Kennedy's head to be intact, she said, no, that is not the photograph I developed. The photograph I developed showed the back of President Kennedy's head to have a large wound there in the back of the head. Now, a large wound is important because it implies an exit wound. Remember that when a bullet enters a body, it enters, essentially in a hole the size of the bullet, and then it's pushing mass in front of it, so it blows out the other side in a blowout wound. And that's what she was essentially describing, which obviously went against the official narrative of the assassination. Remember that the official narrative, as set forth by the Warren Commission report, was that the president had been hit by 2 shots having been fired from the rear by the accused assassin Lee Harvey Oswald. If the president has a blowout wound in the back of his head, that clearly implies a shot having been fired from the front. Now, is Saundra Spencer's testimony just a standalone piece of evidence? Is that all we have to establish this? Because the military's version, remember, is that no, the shots came in from the rear. This is the government's version, and that therefore there's no possibility that she could have developed this photograph showing this massive hole in the back of President Kennedy's head. Now, keep in mind also something that I've emphasized through this series, and that is that when her testimony became public, when the Assassination Records Review Board was wrapping up its operations, there was nobody in the military, the Pentagon, the CIA, anybody, the people at Bethesda National Naval Medical Center, the autopsy physicians who were still alive. They didn't stand up and start screaming and yelling, no, she's lying, she's incorrect, no, she's making this up. No, this was a woman with a lot of credibility. Remember, I remember she worked closely with the White House. She was very professional in the development of social photographs. Remember what Jeremy Gunn said about Saundra Spencer. Now, let me clarify something about Jeremy Gunn. He was the general counsel for the ARRB. He was the lawyer. And I think I said in the previous episode that he did all the questioning of the witnesses. What I meant to say is he did the questioning when there was sworn depositions. But the other staff members certainly conducted a lot of the interviews, some by telephone, some in person. So I thought I'd clear that up. But recall that Jeremy Gunn said that of all the witnesses that appeared before the ARRB, he considered Saundra Spencer to be the most credible of them all. And certainly nobody stood up in the military to question her integrity or professionalism in what she had said in her testimony. Keep in mind also that no member of the mainstream press said, you know what, this is intriguing testimony. Because if she's telling the truth, that clearly implies fraud on the part of the military with a fraudulent photograph. They're falsely depicting the condition of the back of President Kennedy's head. That's a big story. I mean, wouldn't you think just one investigative reporter somewhere across the country would say, man, I can scoop everybody here. I need to get to the bottom of this. They go interview Saundra Spencer. They interview the autopsy physicians. They say, how do you reconcile this? This woman is saying this, and then you interview the people that brought over the film to her. I mean, a good investigative reporter can do all sorts of things. Now, keep in mind that the ARRB was not permitted to investigate this matter. So here they have this testimony from this highly professional woman saying, yeah, I saw a massive hole in the back of President Kennedy's head in the photograph I developed. And now you got a photograph that shows the back of President Kennedy's head to be intact. This screams out for an investigation. But remember, somebody had slipped a provision in the JFK Records Act that said the ARRB cannot investigate anything related to the assassination, and it was strictly enforced by the Board of Trustees. And remember, there were people there watching on the staff, and man, if anybody started to investigate something, they'd call them on it. You're investigating. So here you have this strange situation that cannot get investigated by the very agency that is getting all of these medical records released and medical situations disclosed. So is it just a standalone testimony by Saundra Spencer that establishes that this is a fraudulent photograph? Well, actually not. And for the corroborative evidence, we go back to Dallas. We go to Parkland Hospital where President Kennedy was treated. One of the physicians that treated President Kennedy was a man named Dr. Robert McClellan. He was about in his 30s. Now, keep in mind something important about Parkland Hospital. This is one of the most fantastic trauma hospitals you'd find in the country. I'm almost certain it was a training hospital. I could be mistaken on that, but this is what this hospital specialized in: gunshot wounds, knife wounds, trauma wounds. I mean, if there was, it would be hard to find a better place for President Kennedy to be treated for these gunshot wounds than Parkland Hospital. This is what these doctors did. And so one of the treating physicians was Dr. McClellan, and he went on to have a renowned career in medicine. He ended up publishing a book on surgery. He worked at the Southwestern Medical Center, which is one of the finest medical centers in the country. And like I say, he had this illustrious career. Throughout his life, he told this story of what happened inside Trauma Room 1 when he walked in there. I think he was in his 30s at the time, and this is what he was specializing in. He sees that the doctors that have arrived there before he are doing a tracheotomy. That means that they were taking a scalpel and cutting a thin line across the president's neck to insert a breathing tube to assist him in breathing. The president wasn't conscious. He was unconscious, but he had a pulse. He was still alive. And interestingly enough, there was a hole there that was the size of a bullet, which indicated an entry wound because it was the size of the bullet. And in fact, in a press conference that was held within a couple of hours of President Kennedy's being declared dead, two of the treating physicians said that in their opinion, there was no doubt that that was an entry wound because it was the size of a bullet. So what they did was they took the scalpel and they cut across that hole in order to insert the breathing tube. Well, Dr. McClellan walks into the room while they're doing this tracheotomy, and he decides to go to the head of the table where the president's head was to assist them doing the tracheotomy. And in doing that, he notices that there's this massive wound in the occipital region of President Kennedy's skull. Now, the occipital region is the lower back of the skull. On the sides, it's called the parietal section of the skull. But the center back is called lower back of the skull, is the occipital region. And McClellan said that he saw this massive excised wound in the occipital region. And he also saw cerebellum leaking out of that wound. Now, the reason that's important is the cerebellum is the part of the brain that is in the lower back of the head. So when he sees this, he tells the doctors who are doing the tracheotomy, "Have y'all seen this?" And they said, "Seen what? No, we got in here just a few moments before you did." And he says, "You need to come and see this." And so they come and see this huge excised wound. Now, why did Dr. McClellan deem it necessary to interrupt the tracheotomy to show him this? Well, because that's a fatal wound. I mean, and he knew. He's a treating physician. He's working at one of the best trauma hospitals in the country. He's done, countless injuries dealing with gunshot wounds. He knows this is a fatal wound. Nobody can survive a wound like this. And so there's no point in doing any life-saving procedures on the president. It's just pointless. I mean, the best you can do is make the president feel comfortable. He's unconscious, of course, until he dies. But he's going to die. And that's the importance of why Dr. McClellan brought these other physicians there. And they all saw the wound. And then, of course, the president does die around 20 minutes later. So here you have corroborative evidence from physicians that are there, that are seeing this wound. Now, one of the things, whenever people have addresses, and most people do not talk about this. You see, it's sort of like like Roger Boyagin's statement that said that they snuck the body in early at the Bethesda morgue. He's sort of been airbrushed out, that he doesn't exist, and it's sort of like Saundra Spencer doesn't exist. Don't even address what she's talking about. The same thing here. But the people that have addressed it, that defend the official version, say, oh, they must have imagined this wound. I mean, that under the stress of the situation of treating President Kennedy, they just were under tremendous stress, and they just imagined this wound. Now, Dr. McClellan goes on to have this renowned career. Can you imagine if when he gets in the room, he's under all this stress, and he sees this wound, and he calls the other doctors, he interrupts the tracheotomy to bring him over. Don't you think those doctors would have said, Bob, you're under severe stress here. Obviously, there's no wound there. Your imagination's going crazy with you. I mean, what kind of career would McClellan have had after November 22nd? I mean, the word would have spread. McClellan under stress imagines a gun wound. I mean, it's ridiculous. And then the other doctors too, they're all there examining this imaginary wound. I mean, this is what they're trained to do in one of the best trauma hospitals in the country, and treating the President of the United States. And what kind of career would they've had if word got around that they had imagined this wound? It's ridiculous. Now, does that mean that McClellan is the only one? Now, let me say something else about McClellan. This guy was heroic. An organization gave him a Profiling Courage Award a few years ago. He died just 2 or 3 years ago or so. But they gave him a Profiling Courage Award. I was there, and it was very moving because he never wavered from this story that he told. I mean, he's done any number of interviews over the years, and he's a very humble man and a very genuine guy. I mean, I invite you to see his interviews. They're incredible because you get a sense that this guy ranks right there with Saundra Spencer in terms of credibility and integrity and professionalism. And so I would encourage you to Google Dr. Robert McClellan, head wound, or John Kennedy. If you buy my book, An Encounter with Evil, the Abraham Zapruder story, which I highly recommend, you'll see that there's links to an interview that he did with, and I'm reading from my book here, that he did with the head of plastic and reconstructive surgery. It was Dr. Rajay Rohrich, Rohrich. And you can get that online. The links are in my book. But that's one of the best interviews. It's a 3-part interview, and it's with the American Society of Plastic Surgeons. And every time McClellan would do these interviews, and this is one of the best, this is later on in life. You can also find interviews online that he did earlier in life, both newspaper and in video form. But almost always, if not always, when he gave these interviews, he would put his hand in the back of his head and said he had a wound right back here. And he's, of course, talking about the occipital region of the skull. So I highly recommend you take a look at this. I mean, imagine that you're on a jury and you're faced with having to determine whether this autopsy photograph of the military is fraudulent or not. And you've got Saundra Spencer, who's testified, and just like she did before the ARRB, and how she was told to keep it secret, everything that she had done, and how she was released from her vow of secrecy. Then you got Dr. Robert McClellan coming to testify. And is that all? Well, no. If I were handling this side of the case, I would be presenting more witnesses for you to consider. And let me read you what Dr. Paul Peters, who is another one of the treating physicians. And again, I'm reading from my book, An Encounter with Evil, the Abraham Zapruder story. Peters states, quote, I could see that he had a large, about 7 centimeters opening in the right occipital parietal area, gesturing with his right hand to the back of his head. That's my note. A considerable portion of the brain was missing there. I'm continuing the quote. And the occipital cortex, the back portion of the brain, was lying down near the opening of the wound. Blood was trickling out. Okay, so that's Dr. Peters, one of the treating physicians. Is that all? Well, not exactly. Let me get to the others. Dr. Kemp Clark, professor and director of neurological surgery at Parkland Hospital. He was one of the two physicians that did the press conference after the president was declared dead, and he stated, quote, there was a large wound in the right occipital parietal region, close quote. Another treating physician, Dr. Charles Carrico, he said, quote, there was quite a large defect about here on his skull, and then I say he's pointing to the back of his head, close quote. Parkland Hospital physician Dr. Charles Crenshaw, who actually wrote a book about all this, he told the ARRB that there was a baseball-sized wound in the occipital parietal region in the right rear of the skull. Parkland Hospital physician Dr. Malcolm Perry. Now, Perry was was the other physician that gave the press conference. He was the one that stated, I think 3 times, that in his opinion, this hole here, the bullet-sized hole, was an entry wound. He actually said also the next day that he hardly got any sleep that night because he was getting calls from an FBI agent trying to pressure him into changing his statement that was, in his opinion, an entry wound. That's kind of interesting in and of itself. But he stated, quote, I looked at the head wound briefly by leaning over the table and noticed that the occipital parietal head wound was largely avulsive. Now, avulsive means exploded outward. So remember that a bullet enters the body with a very small hole, essentially the size of the bullet, and then is pushing mass in front of it, so it comes out the other side like a blowout, where the skull is exploded outward, which is meant what they mean by this word, avulsive. So here you have all these treating physicians. And the people that do address this, and like I say, 98% of people that subscribe to the official version never talk about this. This is just one of those things that everybody knows the military and the CIA do not want this talked about. And so it's like Roger Boyjan's testimony. Just ignore it. Don't deal with it. Airbrush it out of history. And this has sort of been airbrushed out of history as far as the mainstream press is concerned. And those that do address it say, oh, all of these doctors that I just said, oh, really, just imagine this wound, in one of the finest trauma hospitals in the country. But it wasn't just them. There was also nurses in Trauma Room 1. Parkland Hospital nurse Audrey Bell, quote, there was a massive wound in the back of his head. Okay, so now you got one of the nurses, and I suppose the official version people would say, oh, well, the nurses were under stress too. Because there's another nurse, Diana Boren, quote, at the back of his skull, an enormous hole, close quote. Okay. Now, there was also a newspaper man that was there at Parkland Hospital when the president's limousine arrived. And he saw the president's condition. His name was Roy Stamps, and he says, I rushed up and saw Kennedy lying in the car on his side. The back of his head was gone. Okay, now clearly this guy isn't suffering the stress of treating the president in Trauma Room 1. He's just a newspaper man that happens to be there, and that's his job, to report on what he observes. Now, there's a Dallas ambulance driver, Aubrey Reich. He was one of the ones that helped place President Kennedy's body into the big, heavy, ornate casket that came from Reich's funeral home and wrapped in white sheets. And he said you could feel the sharp edges of the bone at the edge of the hole in the back of his head. Okay, so clearly this guy is not suffering the stress of having treated the doctor. He's just helping the personnel to put the body into the casket, and he feels the sharp edges of the skull that's exploded outward as he's lifting that part of the body, lifting the head and putting the body into the casket. Now, there was Secret Service agent Clint Hill. Now, Clint Hill's story is pretty interesting. That he was in the follow-up limousine, and when he hears the first shot go off, he immediately gets off that limousine and starts running toward Kennedy's limousine with the objective of lying down on top of the president to protect him from any further shots. Keep in mind that this is what Secret Service agent Roy Kellerman did not do. Kellerman sat there like a bump on the log, staring at the president until the fatal headshot came in, and then his partner, William Greer, takes off and heads to Parkland. But Clint Hill was totally different. He was trying to get there as soon as he could to cover the president. Unfortunately, he didn't make it. It's a very tragic story. To the day he died, he was so disconsolate and grief-stricken and depressed that he had not gotten there in time. You really had to feel sympathy for this man. And when he did get to the limousine, Mrs. Kennedy, as we see in the Zapruder film, was crawling back on the back part of the limousine, and he really, I think, saved her life, because if the limousine starts to take off, there's a good chance she's going to tumble out in the back, or at least saved her from serious injuries. He pushes her back in, and then he covers the president's body with his body, I think hers too. But by that time, of course, it was too late. But on the way to Parkland, he is staring at the back of President Kennedy's head. He's like just inches away from it. He says, quote, "The right rear portion of the head was missing." Okay, so you have all these people in Dallas that are testifying this. Remember, you're on a jury, and I'm here presenting this evidence to you. Now, the military, they've got their lawyer too, and every time we present these witnesses, what's their response? Conspiracy theory, Your Honor, conspiracy theory. I mean, that's all they ever say, conspiracy theory, because that's what the CIA has told them to say. That way people get scared of being called a conspiracy theorist, and so they don't delve into these areas. But that would be the only defense of the military. But let me tell you something else interesting here. It wasn't just people at Parkland that saw this hole in the back of the president's head. There were also people at Bethesda that said that they saw the hole in the back of President Kennedy's head too. This is at the military's own facility. Now, this obviously did not include the 3 autopsy physicians, but it included people there. Bethesda Naval Medical Center, and again, I'm quoting from my book, and all this information is found in Doug Horne's book, because Doug Horne, like I told you, he's written the masterpiece. I mean, he's put the whole thing together in his 5-volume book, Inside the Assassination Records Review Board. Dr. Robert Canada says there was a, quote, very large 3 to 5 centimeter wound in the right rear of the president's head in the lower right occipital region, clearly an exit wound, close quote, because it was, quote, avulsed, close quote. In other words, it exploded outward. Okay, so he's confirming this. This is a doctor there at Bethesda. This is Admiral George Berkeley. He was the president's personal physician. He was both there in Dallas and at Bethesda National Naval Medical Center at the autopsy. Kennedy had a large wound, quote, that had all the appearance of an exit wound in the back of his head. Okay. So I'm presenting all this evidence to you. Berkeley's just taken the stand. He's testified this. Military lawyer says, conspiracy theory, Jacob, conspiracy theory. And that's all he's saying, you see. The FBI agent, there are 2 FBI agents there in the Bethesda morgue during the autopsy. They were named Francis O'Neill and James Seibert. And they prepared an extensive, detailed report. Interestingly enough, they were not summoned to testify about this report to the Warren Commission. In fact, the first time that they were asked to testify about their report was before the ARRB. It was like people had airbrushed Seibert and O'Neill out of history too, and as well as their report. And so they testified before the ARRB, and you get a sense of why they were not asked to testify before the Warren Commission, or the House Select Committee for that matter, in the 70s. They were shown the same photograph that Saundra Spencer was shown, the official autopsy photograph showing the back of President Kennedy's head to be intact. Seibert says, quote, well, I don't have a recollection of it being that intact. I don't remember seeing anything like this, close quote. And then his partner, FBI agent Francis O'Neill, he, same thing, testifying before the ARRB under oath They show him this photograph that had been shown to Saundra Spencer and it was shown to Seibert. He says, quote, "This looks like it's been doctored in some way. Quite frankly, I thought there was a larger opening in the back of the head." So there you have it. There's all my evidence that I've established for you. The military's lawyer, all that he said during all this testimony is conspiracy theory, Your Honor, conspiracy theory, and he just keeps repeating that ad infinitum. How are you going to rule here? I believe that this evidence establishes beyond a reasonable doubt easily that the photograph falsely depicts the back of President Kennedy's head. That means it's a fraudulent photograph. There's no other way around it. I mean, one option is all these people got together, the doctors, the newsmen, the Clint Hill, the FBI, they all got together in this massive conspiracy to come up with this hole in the back of President Kennedy's head. That's ridiculous. Okay, and the possibility that they're all independently mistaken, ridiculous. That leaves only one option here, and that's a fraudulent photograph. So when you add this fraudulent photograph over to sneaking the body in early, that's Marine Sergeant Boyagin's statement, and along with all those Navy personnel that carried the body into the morgue at the shipping casket, you have a clear evidence of fraud. Now, we still have to examine a lot more about what was going on here. But right off the bat, once you establish a fraudulent photograph, that's it. It's over. Now, why is this so important? Because it indicates criminal culpability in the assassination itself. There's no way around it. Remember, this plot for the fraudulent autopsy was launched at Parkland Hospital at the very moment that Kennedy's declared dead. That could not have been a spur-of-the-moment decision because it's launched at the moment he's declared dead. There's no way that Roy Kellerman just said, "Hey, I think I'll launch a fraudulent autopsy and get this body out of here and threaten to kill everybody who gets in my way." No, he said he was operating under orders. Those orders had to have come from Johnson. Johnson's over there at Love Field taking the seats out of Air Force One to make room for the casket to be brought in. He wasn't going to wait 2 or 3 hours for an autopsy. And so when would those orders have been issued? Well, one possibility is in the 20 minutes that Johnson was there at the hospital. But that's problematic because, what if somebody overhears this order being delivered? And what if Kellerman doesn't understand the importance of it? My hunch is that this was built into the assassination itself, long before the assassination itself, because you couldn't take a chance. The center to this assassination is the cover-up. And center to the cover-up is the fraudulent autopsy, which is launched at the moment President Kennedy is declared dead. And so when you add all this up and you put it all together and you say, okay, it's launched immediately there. Kellerman's saying we're operating under orders. He's doing everything he can, including threatening deadly force against Dr. Earl Rose and the medical personnel that interfere with him. The body is taken to Johnson. He flies to Andrews Air Force Base. The body is placed in the hands of the military, who sneak it in and almost an hour and a half before the official entry time at 8 p.m. And now we have a fraudulent photograph that falsely depicts the back of President Kennedy's head to be intact. All of this necessarily, there's no way to avoid it, indicates that this is all wrapped up into one package of an assassination and a fraudulent autopsy that is part of that cover-up. There's no other logical explanation for this. There is no innocent explanation for a fraudulent autopsy. Nobody has ever come up with one. No one ever will. And we haven't even gotten started yet on the fraud. What we're dealing with here is sneaking the body in early, lying about it, covering it up, airbrushing it out of history. And now we've got a fraudulent autopsy that fraudulently and falsely depicts the back of President Kennedy's head with, I think, the biggest stack of credible witnesses that you could ever find. Saundra Spencer, Dr. McClellan, Dr. Peters, FBI agents, Clint Hill, Secret Service. I mean, the evidence is overwhelming in terms of clear and convincing evidence of what was going on here. So that's where we are. We're at the beginning stages of this fraudulent autopsy, which already, I hold, establishes criminal culpability on the part of the national security establishment, the people who conducted the fraudulent autopsy in the assassination of President Kennedy. I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is episode 8 of the JFK assassination 60 years later. I look forward to talking to y'all in episode 9.